recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to take my place to respond to this year's budget. I recognize that budget days tend to be celebratory affairs for governments, an opportunity to put forth their agendas and point out key investments that reflect their commitment to particular goals and policies, to fulfill campaign promises, to generate hope and excitement for the year ahead. But it is hard, Honourable Speaker, right now to feel particularly celebratory. We are reeling from the ongoing risk to our health and the tragic loss of lives to COVID-19. Our hospitals are being stretched to the limit. Healthcare workers, exhausted from 13 months of a pandemic that has become its most ferocious in this brutal third wave, are pleading with us to do all we can to prevent infections from rising. Young people are struggling with separation from friends and family, spending the last year having to manage loss of income, loss of opportunities, and loss of the kinds of experiences, attending university in person, traveling, meeting new people, that all of us took for granted as part of our lives. And a year into this pandemic, with what appears to be widespread acknowledgement that it has laid bare the deep and structural inequalities in our society, a year into this pandemic, the rich have gotten richer, and those with the lowest paying jobs, the highest risks, and the most marginalized communities have borne the hugest costs of this pandemic: loss of jobs and income, loss of health, loss of lives. COVID didn't just expose inequality in our world, it deepened it. We can see it right in the budget documents. Quote, the BC unemployment rate averaged 8.9% in 2020 and 7.5% year-to-date to February 2021, up from 4.9% in the first months of 2020. There has been some recovery, but as of February 2021, quote, there were still 15,100 fewer people employed than in February 2020. In addition, we see in the budget that, quote, the share of unemployed people that have been without work for 27 weeks or more was 33% in February 2021, its highest reading in 36 years. In February 2020, to compare, it was 12.8%. This is a deepening of entrenched poverty for more people in British Columbia. At the same time, revenues from property transfer taxes were significantly higher than expected due to a housing market that saw rising prices and sales at a rate that have left many who are looking for homes unable to even get a bid in before the house is sold. Those with wealth and assets saw their wealth, for the most part, increase, and in some cases increase dramatically in the past year. Those without significant wealth and assets, for the most part, saw their incomes decline and the opportunity to enter the housing market become even more out of reach. Inequality, already a significant problem before COVID-19, has become worse. There have been many studies on the effects of inequality in societies, and the findings are consistent and stark. From Inomics.com, an economics research site, we get a summary of some of the societal impacts of inequality. Research by sociologists Mary Paskoff and Carolyn DeWild has shown that living in unequal societies fundamentally changes the way that people interact with those living around them, and more broadly, how they perceive their community. Most notably, intersocietal solidarity, that is, the willingness of individuals to try and improve the living conditions of other members of their community, suffers. They go on. As the collective traits of generosity and compassion reduce, the social cohesion is damaged. The slippery slope is then further greased. The same study shows that declining solidarity is quickly reflected in dwindling public support for government-led redistribution, which for communities facing high levels of inequality is exactly what is most needed. Economist Henrik Jordahl has looked further, linking greater social distance not just to estrangement, but to higher levels of mistrust. Specifically, the growing belief that other members of one's community are fundamentally different from oneself. Declining trust is not exclusive to individuals, but extends to people's faith in institutions. In a research paper exploring the impact of inequality on values and attitudes, social scientist Frederick L. Pryor found that people in less equal countries had less interest in politics, less confidence in their sitting parliament, and often bemoaned a societal lack of respect for authority. Addressing inequality, Honorable Speaker, can't be something that we approach with disparate policies and investment. It needs to be the lens that we apply to all of government policy, legislation, and budgeting. We need to relentlessly ask the question, does this move us to become a more or a less equal society? And we need to make the decision that we need to be a more equal society. At the same time, over the course of this last year, we have seen the relentless ravaging brought on by climate change, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss. It has been yet another year of records. From the State of the Climate 2021 report, there are many sobering statistics. Record CO2 levels, hitting 417 parts per million last May. The past decade was the hottest on record. The year 2020 was more than 1.2 degrees hotter than the average year in the 19th century. In Europe, it was the hottest year ever, while globally 2020 tied with 2016 as the warmest. The exceptionally warm temperatures triggered the largest wildfires ever recorded in the US states of California and Colorado, and the black summer of fires in Eastern Australia. In June 2020, the temperature reached 38 degrees Celsius in eastern Siberia, the hottest ever recorded in the Arctic Circle. The Arctic is heating twice as quickly as the rest of the world, and as less ice makes it through the warm summer months, we lose its reflective protection. In its place, large areas of open, dark water absorb more heat, fueling global warming further. Quote, globally, forest areas continue to decline, says Bonnie Waring, senior lecturer at the Grantham Institute, noting that there are big regional differences. But protecting existing forests, she tells us, is even more important than planting new ones. Every time an ecosystem is disturbed, you see carbon lost. The World Economic Forum's report on the risks of biodiversity loss states, quote, all species, including humans, depend for their survival on the delicate balance of life in nature. Yet biodiversity, the diversity within species, between species, and within ecosystems is declining faster than it has and at any other time in human history. The current rate of extinction is tens to hundreds of times higher than the average over the past 10 million years. And it is accelerating. Although the world's 7.6 billion people represent just 0.01% of all living creatures, humanity has already caused the loss of 83% of all wild mammals and half of plants. As reported in Forbes magazine, the World Economic Forum does not mince words when it comes to the economic risks of climate change. Quote, "Climate change, to which no one is immune, continues to be a catastrophic risk. Although lockdowns worldwide caused global emissions to fall in the first half of 2020, evidence from the 2008-2009 financial crisis warns that emissions could bounce back. A shift towards greener economies cannot be delayed until the shocks of the pandemic subside." Climate action failure is the most impactful and second most likely long-term risk identified in the report. The advice that the report offers, quote, "As governments, businesses, and societies begin to emerge from the pandemic, they must now urgently shape new economic and social systems that improve our collective resilience and capacity to respond to shocks while reducing inequality, improving health, and protecting the planet." That's the World Economic Forum. Let's compare this to the summary report of BC's Economic Forecast Council that was released in yesterday's budget. In the summary of the report from our Economic Forecast Council, climate is mentioned once in the same sentence as LNG. Quote, "Other topics discussed by the Council included the general resilience of LNG development and other capital projects despite minor pandemic-related delays, recent strength in the natural resources sector, particularly forestry, and issues surrounding climate change." End quote. LNG, the natural resources sector, and, quote, "issues surrounding climate change." That's the extent of the consideration that we get to see in the budget from the advice given to the minister and her staff from the Economic Council. That's the extent that they thought needed to be given to climate change, which is the greatest risk to future generations. What about the housing crisis? From the same summary report. Quote, "Looking ahead, renewed international migration after a pandemic-induced lull is expected to help support BC's housing market." There's a worry, Honourable Speaker, that the out-of-control housing prices that are blocking more and more people in this province out of the potential of home ownership is not recognized as a problem in this summary. But what about inequality? What did our Economic Forecast Council have to say about inequality? Nothing. Not a word. In fact, and let's sit with this for a moment, the word inequality does not appear once, not once, in this entire budget document. Not once. All of the suffering, all of the sacrifices of this last year, all that we've seen and learned about how deeply rooted inequality and racism are in our province, our country, and our world, we have a budget from what is supposed to be a progressive social democratic government, and there is not a single mention of inequality. Just to be fair, I also looked for the word equity. And just like climate change, equity got passing mention in the summary of the Economic Council's discussions. Quote, "Key topics of discussion included the varied impacts of COVID-19 pandemic across industries and GBA plus identity factors, government policies to support the economy while maintaining fiscal discipline, issues around equity and inclusion, BC's housing market, the outlook for immigration and trade, and uncertainty in the global economic outlook. Issues surrounding climate change and issues around equity and inclusion. The two greatest challenges that we collectively face in our world, and in BC, what our Economic Council has to say is that there are issues. And so yesterday, when we responded to the budget by indicating that we believe that this government has missed a pivotal moment to pair our recovery from COVID-19 with a transformative plan for this province that would ensure a green and just future for British Columbia, it was an expression of our dashed hopes that this government would seize this historic moment that we are in and truly set our province on a course that our grandchildren could thank us for. But this is not what was delivered yesterday. As so many others have also expressed, this was essentially a status quo budget after what has been the least status quo year that any of us have experienced in our lifetimes. What's our common agenda? What's the story of where we're going as a province? Where is the unifying sense of what we're trying to achieve together? Compare this to the United States budget with an ambitious climate action and a commitment to economic transformation and innovation at its center. Or to New Zealand with health and well-being as the organizing principle for budget decisions. We are still operating without a cohesive purpose for how we spend money and what overarching outcomes we are trying to achieve in this province. Right now, around the world, other jurisdictions are recognizing that reducing inequality, addressing the climate crisis, and building a clean economy are not just nice to haves. They are imperatives. They need to be at the center of our recovery from this pandemic. To achieve this, Honorable Speaker, it starts with how we measure success. We need to start measuring our economy holistically and get serious about reducing inequality and reducing the share of our economy that harms well-being, like an out-of-control housing market. I remain troubled by this government's continued sole reliance on narrow economic indicators like GDP growth that don't truly capture the health of the economy or how well it is serving the people of this province. Our continued reliance on GDP ignores and papers over an uneven and unstable economic foundation that actually harms people, partly driven as it is by the affordability crisis, household debt, and unsustainable resource extraction. Under the Confidence and Supply Agreement, we worked closely with the NDP, including with some extremely dedicated and motivated public servants, to develop a suite of genuine progress indicators for BC. I'm disappointed that the work that we started together doesn't seem to have come to anything with this new majority government. It is crucial that we start to measure the health of our economy differently if we're going to start making different decisions that support the health and well-being of people, and if we're going to build an economy that is inclusive and sustainable. One place in this budget where we can see the problem clearly is with housing. Growth in housing sales and prices drove revenue gains to government, partly helping to reduce our projected deficit. On the surface, and because of how we measure our economy, this looks like a positive. But we know that the housing affordability crisis is damaging communities and leaving young British Columbians in extremely precarious and stressful situations. British Columbians have lived with a growing affordability crisis for years, and they know that growth driven by an out-of-control housing market actually makes life harder. BC's economy continues to rely far too much on real estate to drive revenues. We need to change the way we assess the health of the economy if we're going to address the structural inequalities that are built into it and that are being exacerbated by the rising housing costs and prices. While I welcome the enhanced investment into the housing hub and into building, quote, missing middle supply, we cannot get ourselves out of this problem by expanding supply alone. I think it's disappointing and frankly dangerous for the health of society that neither this budget nor the recent federal budget take in any action to cool the housing market and reduce the affordability crisis gripping cities across BC. This is an extremely troubling omission, not only for young people who cannot afford to buy or rent a decent home for themselves, but for the health and long-term sustainability of the economy and local communities. I welcome investments to youth mental health care, but we need to provide all British Columbians with the care they need to live healthy and fulfilling lives. It's time to treat mental health like a right and fully incorporate it into our healthcare system. Providing proactive, accessible, and regulated mental health services is an important step in addressing inequality in this province, as well as addressing many other crises we see. The budget fails to expand a regulated safe supply to combat the toll that the toxic, illicit drugs are taking on people, which this very government promised to do less than a year ago. 5 British Columbians are dying every day from bad drug policy, and that is unacceptable. Without immediate solutions like safe supply available, people will die before they can access any treatment beds or supervised consumption sites. We cannot address this crisis without addressing mental health. In light of increasing deaths from a toxic supply and increasing demand for emergency psychiatric services, we must be proactive in supporting British Columbians. That care should start by ensuring everyone who needs mental health care can access it. On issues like seniors' care and reducing poverty, we see some good steps, but still a lacking commitment to deal with systemic issues. It is no doubt a positive step that for the first time in many years, we are seeing significant increase to income and disability assistance in this province. However, while these increases are welcome, they still leave people receiving supports well below the poverty line. This budget also ignores many of the evidence-based recommendations that were made last year by the Basic Income Expert Panel to transform our social safety net and implement targeted basic income for people with disabilities, women fleeing violence, and youth aging out of care. This government promised to, quote, fix the cracks in our seniors' care system, and yet in this budget we only see $68 million over 3 years targeted towards hiring additional staff. This pandemic has highlighted the urgent need to support our seniors, and this budget missed an opportunity to take even initial steps to increase the quality of care provided and enhance oversight for the long-term care sector. It's unfortunate we did not see a commitment from this government to take the steps recommended by seniors advocate Isabel McKenzie to improve transparency and oversight of public funds that go to for-profit seniors care in British Columbia, and to ensure that the requirements are being met in every seniors care home in this province. One of the most profoundly disappointing aspects of this budget is the area of natural resource management, and specifically forestry. It gives me no joy to say that this budget seems to confirm what many have been concerned about, that the NDP's promises to do things differently on the environment, on land use, on forestry, and on old growth protection are indeed empty words. That there's no intention to back them up with real action that would elicit any change on our landscape. The Premier promised during the recent election to do things differently on old growth and to implement all of the Old Growth Review Panel's recommendations, including an immediate halt to logging in BC's most at-risk old growth forests within 6 months, and a new science-based approach to forest management that prioritizes biodiversity and proactive, adequately funded local and provincial transition plans. As a union of BC Indian chiefs and conservation groups made extremely clear, a shift away from old growth logging simply cannot happen without adequate funding, including conservation financing and funding for Indigenous-led protected areas. With this budget, the government has shown they have no intention of changing the status quo of old growth logging in any meaningful way. The minister, when pressed on how they would fund enhanced old growth protection, said it would come from within Flynn Road's budget. But the forestry budget is being slashed, Honourable Speaker, by $41 million this year and $30 million next year. As Andrea Innes from the Ancient Forest Alliance said, quote, "The BC government has missed a critical opportunity to show British Columbians that it is serious about its old growth commitments. Despite promising a complete paradigm shift in the way BC's forests are managed, the NDP government's 2021 budget is bereft of meaningful solutions to make it happen." She asks, how does the province expect to protect ancient forest ecosystems, support communities, and overhaul its forest management regime with less funding than it had before? And so, Honourable Speaker, I expect we will see more of the same. The loss of these irreplaceable ecosystems and the reliance on a short-term and fundamentally unsustainable source of jobs and revenues for local communities. This lack of funding particularly stings because it means that BC risks foregoing the opportunity to partner with the federal government and leverage matching federal funds to protect these ecosystems. The federal government has committed billions of dollars to protect endangered ecosystems and to support Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And I cannot understand the possibility that this government would potentially walk away and leave hundreds of millions of federal dollars on the table. This is part of the broader trend of reduced investment in land use and natural resource management. The proportion of the budget spent on natural resource management has declined steadily, year by year, regardless of who has been in power. And while the total BC budget has gone up, the amount we spend on managing our natural resources and our lands has declined. And this is in the face of a biodiversity and climate crisis and more complex land use decisions and processes than we've ever had before. It's no wonder that we are seeing declines in species and erosion of critical habitats because we don't commit the necessary funding to manage our lands and our resources sustainably. I'll add to this, Mr. Speaker, and I expect that this is an experience for most of the MLAs who represents rural and semi-rural ridings. People are dismayed that they see activities on the land base that clearly contradict regulations and rules, whether it's the destruction of riparian areas, whether it is mining without a permit, whether it is dumping of soil illegally, whether it is destruction of habitat, whether it's activities on ALR land that are not allowed. All of those are happening in my riding. And when the citizens turn to government to enforce the regulations, to enforce the rules, what they hear more often than not is, we simply don't have the staff to ensure that there's compliance of these regulations. There's nothing we can do. In one case, Mr. Speaker, there is a community in the Cowichan Valley where there has been mining operations for over a decade, often without any permitting at all. Rocks have flown into people's yards. Groundwater has been affected. And yet, despite relentless efforts of a community association, and I think I probably have well over a dozen of my own missives to government and conversations with officials, this kind of activity just carries on. The rules aren't enforced because there aren't enough people to enforce those rules. And what we see in this budget is a shrug, a decrease in funds to ensure that what happens on BC's land base actually just follows the basic rules that exist. In the areas of climate and innovation, this budget makes some solid investments, including investments in the clean tech sector and the new Strategic Innovation Fund and funding to continue Clean BC. I was glad to see this budget follow through on the commitment to create a $500 million strategic investment fund for BC. A fund like this is something that we've been calling for years. This type of fund could go a significant way to supporting the growth of BC's tech startups by funding for the programs and supports necessary to scale. We still need to see more details about how this fund's mandate exists and how it will be deployed. If it is used strategically to support innovation and the scaling up of companies aligned with ambitious environmental and social goals, it could be a significant positive for our economy. Those are big ifs. And we will really want to see details about how to ensure that that happens. This budget makes modest increases to continue to implement Clean BC. I welcome the investment into zero-emission vehicles, steps towards enhancing the electrification of our transportation sector, and the investment into energy efficiency in communities. However, with this budget, government is not rising to the challenge of the climate crisis with the funding and ambition that is required. As Clean Energy Canada has said in its response to this budget, quote, "As countries around the world ratchet up their climate ambitions, climate action and economic action are increasingly one and the same. Canada's largest trading partners like the US and the EU have recognized the huge economic opportunity in transitioning to a net zero world, as did the federal government's budget release yesterday. We would have liked to see greater recognition of this net zero opportunity in BC's economic plan." Even the government's language of a, quote, greener recovery, not a green recovery, makes this lack of ambition very clear. We can and we must do so much more to tackle the defining challenge of our time and seize the opportunity that is presented if we truly transition our economy. In conclusion, Honourable Speaker, there's been a lot of commentary comparing COVID and the varying responses to it from governments around the world to the similar threat that climate change poses and the similar varying responses that we see. COVID is a much more immediate threat, and yet so many governments have found it difficult to shift away from the status quo in response to this very new, very different threat of a virus. At the same time, there have been countries and provinces here in Canada that responded decisively and aggressively to COVID. New Zealand, Vietnam, Australia, South Korea, and here, the Maritimes. These governments decided that the risk of COVID was a risk they did not want to mitigate. It was a risk they wanted to eliminate. As Prime Minister Arden said, aiming for zero doesn't mean that it is a guaranteed success, but it does mean that a lot fewer people will get ill or die. We now look with envy at these countries where gatherings happen, families come together, and ironically, return to the actual status quo was achieved much more quickly than those of us in places where mitigation was chosen over elimination. These countries have also had much less negative impacts to their economies, which rebounded more quickly and are now enjoying the benefits of almost full economic activity. And this teaches us a valuable lesson. It's hard to make difficult choices in response to risks that lie in the future, risks that are not right in front of us. And yet, as governments and decision makers, this is exactly what is required of us. Taking a passive and reactive approach to risks and threats that we know are coming is not what the people who we serve need us to do. They need us to identify the measures that need to be taken so that there is the least harm from these risks and these threats. And while we continue to navigate the very real and very present risk of COVID-19, we must absolutely look at the horizon and recognize that growing inequality and accelerating climate change are going to create more upheaval, more suffering, and more loss. We have to be relentlessly willing to learn, and perhaps most importantly, acknowledge and learn from our mistakes. It's what's needed most from those of us who occupy the seats in this House. There will be much more to look at with this budget. We look forward to the estimates process, and I thank you, Honourable Speaker, for my opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Member.